Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
Today we're going to go up to the Great Lakes region, and we're starting to get to the end of this season of the Ducks Unlimited podcast, and so we're entering into some season recap type of shows. We're going to have a few of those coming up where we will talk about sort of a season in review, but we'll also cover some of the survey results from Midwinter surveys that have been conducted by the different state agencies here over the past few weeks. So we're recording this episode on January 20th. And we're going to be visiting with the waterfowl staff specialist of the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, and that person is Steve Courts, a friend of mine. Like many of the guests on this podcast are friends of mine, so I'm happy to welcome in Steve to the podcast. So, Steve, thank you for sharing your time and welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Mike.
We're going to start out with, I guess, well, let me first say that we're going to have a couple of topics that we'll talk about here with you. One of them is, as I've kind of introduced, a season recap, here how the waterfowl season went in Minnesota. And I'm actually going to get you to give an update on where you stand with regard to the season. I'm not sure if you have any seasons that are remaining open at this time, but we'll cover that. And then also I wanted you to talk about a hunter opinion survey that I know y'all have out to your hunters right now, and you're seeking input from them. So this is an opportunity to discuss that and share some insight on that, and tell people, listeners in Minnesota, hunters in Minnesota, if they haven't heard about it, how they can access it and how they can provide their input. So we have a couple of things to discuss with you, but first I wanted to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself to our listeners. Tell us a bit about your personal and professional background.
Yeah, I guess I grew up in South Dakota. Went to grad school in Iowa, studied ducks in northern Iowa for my master's, and spent a couple of years in Texas. And then I've been up in Minnesota now for, I guess, 17 plus years. So I enjoy it. I'm happy to be up here. It's a fun job and enjoy talking to hunters, and pretty avid duck hunter myself. So pretty engaged, I think, in all aspects of ducks in Minnesota.
Yeah, so Steve, you are the waterfowl staff specialist, as I've talked about, and that's like as we go around the state, there are different position titles assigned to people that do relatively similar jobs. So you would be sort of the equivalent in terms of job function as Larry Reynolds or Luke Naylor or Andy Radicke.
Exactly. Yep.
And some of the other states that we've heard about. So you interact with those individuals, engage with those individuals in the Mississippi Flyway. What do you guys call it? The Game Bird Tech Section? Is that what it is?
It is. Yep.
Okay, and so I think other flyways refer to it as the waterfowl technical section. So slight deviations in the name, but all kind of functioning the same way. You are the state liaison to the flyways in a lot of the harvest management discussions, migratory bird management discussions that occur, and that influence some of the a lot of the different migratory bird management issues affecting your state.
Right.
Yeah, and so that kind of gives a connection to you, between you and some of the other guests that our listeners would have heard about and heard from already. So just wanted to point that out. So Steve, help me out here. We want to talk a little bit about some of the surveys that are conducted here around Midwinter. We've spoken with a few of your colleagues already, and we have a few others lined up. And certainly here in the South, those kind of surveys return a much larger number of birds in those counts. But I'm not real familiar with what type of counts, whether y'all even conduct the Midwinter survey in Minnesota. I know North Dakota does because we saw some results from them a couple of days ago. Do y'all do a Midwinter survey up in Minnesota?
We do not anymore. For the most part, we're frozen by early January statewide, so it's just not worth any time to do a count. In the past, we've done very limited ground surveys. We certainly have a handful of ducks and geese still here, but it's just not worth our time to go out and try and count a couple thousand ducks, as opposed to Arkansas, Louisiana, something like that.
That's kind of what I was suspicious of, but I wanted to kind of confirm that. Now, I'm going to ask you about sort of a hunting season recap here in a moment, but first, I want to ask you a question that's going to be impossible for you to answer, but I'm going to do it anyway, because we saw some results from North Dakota. They actually do sort of a limited survey around the midwinter period, and they reported an approximate 50% increase over the long-term average in the number of Canada geese and mallards that they're still seeing in their state. It's not a large number. I think it was like 160, somewhere in the 100 to 200,000 range for Canada geese. And then, I don't know, maybe 30,000 mallards or something in that near. So in an absolute number, not a lot, but above average. Do you have any sense if the number of ducks and geese that you are seeing now, totally anecdotally speaking, is unusually large, or is it really impossible to get a good feel for that?
It's certainly not large. I would say it's probably normal, but we frozen statewide. So other than a little bit of open water on rivers and some aerated lakes in southern Minnesota, we do not have a ton of geese and ducks in Minnesota now, and we really never have in January.
Yeah, that's kind of what I figured. It's been a really weird winter. You're talking about how now you're completely frozen, and but then we've had sort of an average winter down here in terms of temperature, but we certainly have not seen over the past few weeks any of the extreme cold spells. We did back in October, but then that was pretty much it. So we're going to have some other episodes here in the future where we'll talk about some of that in more detail, sort of a larger scale season recap type discussion. But I wanted to make sure I touched on that with you. Do you have any waterfowl, any goose seasons that would still be open right now? Probably not, right?
We closed. I think it was the 2nd of January, but that's typically when the goose seasons all end.
Well, Steve, if you could, let's do a bit of a season recap. You would have had your season open at the time when we had that strong or unusually cold October weather. So let's just kind of pick up there and talk about how that may have influenced your waterfowl hunter success, your waterfowl numbers, and then broad overview of how the season unfolded from that point forward.
So our season's open for ducks in late September. We open goose season in early September, and the first couple of weeks of duck season, by all reports, were good. About mid-October, we froze and had snow pretty much statewide and kind of shut everything down for about 2 weeks. But like early season was pretty good hunting, and then really no hunting in late October. But things statewide opened up for pretty much all November, and it was pretty good hunting if you poked around and scouted a little bit. So I think statewide we had a pretty decent duck season. I had a meeting this morning and got a whole bunch of reports from different managers in the state, and they kind of echoed the same thing, that overall it was not a bad duck season.
Well, that's good to hear. Did that October weather, I mean, did it affect you guys as much as it kind of felt like it did with regard to duck numbers here in the mid-latitude and southern latitudes? We've spoken with Andy Radke, and he talked about, and in Illinois, Aaron Yetter, and they spoke about this big influx of birds in late October. Did you see big movements of birds associated with that cold October?
I think the first couple of days when we froze, we did, but then after that, we were frozen statewide on pretty much anything but our super big lakes. So just no water for ducks to stage on. So we sent a lot of birds south, and they just weren't here. Yeah, so it was pretty good hunting for a couple days, and then it kind of ended for 10 to 12 days or something like that.
I guess I didn't realize that. If I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying that October, that really cold October, froze up a lot of your waters, and then you really didn't see those thaw at all after that point?
They reopened in November, but we had open water in November statewide, but didn't have a whole lot of ducks. They were kind of scattered. If you scouted, you could find them. But I think in terms of birds migrating south from Canada, if they came in October, as we're freezing, I think they just kept going.
Okay. You also mentioned something else that makes me want to ask about sort of a different topic here. We spoke a lot last summer and fall about the border closure with Canada, and we were speculating about how it may result in an increase in the number of hunters, out-of-state hunters that we would see in some of the northern tier states, South Dakota, North Dakota, maybe even Minnesota. Do you have any returns on your license sales this year to be able to tell if you did see in Minnesota an increase in the number of out-of-state hunters?
No, our duck hunter numbers were... they've been about 80,000 in terms of state waterfowl stamps sold for probably the last 6 to 7 years. That's about half of what they were in the 70s, and we didn't see any increase this year. And we typically don't get a whole lot of non-resident hunters here, as opposed to North South Dakota. I think we sell probably less than 2,000 non-resident waterfowl stamps. We don't have a whole lot of non-resident hunters here.
That would have been my suspicion on that as well, but I was not certain of that, and so I wanted to ask. It's one of the other things that we'll be looking forward to here as we go through the summer months and talk with some of our state partners and look at some of the duck stamp returns. And we've heard about how the pandemic has renewed the interest of a lot of people in outdoor activities, hunting and fishing being among those. And so we'll be curious to see if that did translate into any kind of increase in the number of waterfowl hunters, migratory bird hunters that we'll see across any of the other states. So I just wanted to kind of touch base with you on that. Steve, anything else noteworthy from this waterfowl hunting season with regard to hunter success? I suspect as a state waterfowl biologist, you can get a pretty valuable index into how satisfied waterfowl hunters are by the number of sort of disgruntled calls that you might get. Do you have any sense of how this season might have been, or anything notable about it, whether with regard to the large number of a certain species that perhaps was anomalous or anything of that nature? Anything else to add here before we leave this topic?
I think the only thing I would add is we had more scaup here, certainly than I've seen in probably the last 10 to 15 years. And scaup hunting was very good, late October, early November. But with a low bag limit and not a lot of hunters out at that time, I don't think our harvest will go up much. But other than that, I think it was a decent season, but I'd probably rank it like a 6 on a scale of 1 to 10, something like that.
Compared to some of the conversations I have had with Southern hunters, we would take a 6 all day long this year down here. I think many would probably rank it a 1 or a 2. I think there's been some good success in local pockets, but we're still waiting for some kind of movement to salvage the season for a lot of people, but we'll see how that goes. We don't have a whole lot of time remaining at this point, and the weather forecast looks ugly, and ugly in the sense of not very conducive to moving a lot of birds around or bringing new birds into us. Let's move on to, I guess, a related topic, which is something that your state is doing and other states do on occasion, which is conduct surveys to actually actively seek input from their hunter constituents on various topics. And so you have a survey that's out right now that you are seeking that very input with. And so I wanted to talk with you about that a little bit. Tell us about this survey, the Hunter Opinion Survey. What's it designed to achieve? What particular type of information are you seeking from your hunters? For the most part, we're trying to get input on about 10 different regulation items, but it's kind of a 4-part survey. And step 1, we asked all our area managers statewide to reach out to anyone they know, avid duck hunters, groups, DU, Delta, Audubon, tribal nations, to seek input from them first. And then step 2, we have an online survey that's open until the end of January. You can find the link on our DNR webpage.
Step 3 is a mail-out survey. The survey is at the printer today, and will go out in a day or two to, I think, 7,000 waterfowl hunters. And then step 4 is in March, I'm going to do a webinar, and we'll take additional input and review the results we've had today from those other surveys. So it's pretty much across the board. Any person in Minnesota can comment. It's certainly targeted to waterfowl hunters, but as much input as we've ever taken at one time. So we'll see what the results from all that is, I guess, before making recommendations to our commissioner in April.
I'm glad you added that last point, because this information, it's not like we just collect this information just to kind of get a feel for what the hunters are thinking and our constituents are thinking. This information is used to inform decisions that are ultimately made by the commission with regard to various hunting regulations, waterfowl, maybe migratory bird. I'm not sure. Are other migratory birds included in this survey?
Nope, just waterfowl.
So decisions with regard to waterfowl in this case. Now, what about the history of this survey or any other surveys like it? Have y'all conducted them periodically in the past?
Yeah, we've done mail-out hunter surveys. We do them about every third year, going back, I think, to 2000 was the first one we did, and they've been every 2 to 3 years. We've also taken public input a few times, but often it's directed to, maybe one lake or one area, some minor issue, and not really reached out to like everyone. So that's a little bit different. And we've also never really asked our management staff to engage with, folks in their work areas to get input that way. And we've never really done a webinar to look at the results from the surveys. We certainly write reports and post those on our webpage, but that's different this time. So it's a pretty engaged effort, I guess, is how I might frame it.
Yeah, so the webinar is designed to share the data, to share the results. I shouldn't say the data, but share the results with the constituents of the state of Minnesota. I think that's a great idea. What are some examples of the type of questions? You might have touched on this a bit, but I want to just make sure that we get this. What are some examples of the type of questions that you're asking, and then how will those be used? Are we talking about zones and splits and preferred opening and closing dates, or is it other questions beyond that?
Yeah, certainly one is zones and splits and season timing. Second would be a teal season. We're the only state in Mississippi Flyway that does not have a teal season. So we're asking input on that. Third would be state regulations we have. We end the shooting hours at 4 o'clock the first couple of weeks of duck season, and we're asking about going to sunset. Another one is we're asking about preference for an increased Canada goose bag limit to 5 a day. We restrict motorized decoys here first couple of weeks of the duck season, and on WMAs the entire season. So we asked about changing that. And then a couple other maybe minor issues. One would be we don't allow open water duck hunting, and it's allowed in pretty much any other state. In Minnesota, you have to hunt in concealing vegetation, so you can't hunt in a layout boat or an anchored boat line. So we asked about that, and I think that's about it.
That's interesting, Steve, and I thank you for providing those details. We've had a multi-part series with, it's included Dale Humberg, Ken Babcock, and now Jim Nichols, and then moving forward, Jim Dabowski and Scott Boomer, talking about harvest management and how regulations are sort of overarching umbrella at the national level, federal level. But then within that umbrella, under that umbrella, within the framework afforded by the federal legislation, federal regulation, states can do different things that can be more restrictive, but not less restrictive than what the federal allowances provide. And so Minnesota is a great example where you have some regulations that are perhaps more restrictive. Well, not perhaps. They are a bit more restrictive in some regards than what we find in some other states. And so that's interesting. There's probably an entire discussion on the history of those regulations and how they came about and how long they've been in existence and, kind of what the thinking is behind them. But we don't have time for that here. But nevertheless, it's some additional insight for people to realize just how variable some of these different state-specific regulations can be. So that's some pretty neat things to learn there. What's the deadline for completing this survey, Steve?
The end of January. It's on our webpage.
Okay, so people can find it on your webpage, and that's just Minnesota DNR. I'm not sure what the URL is, but we're all savvy enough internet-wise now to be able to find that, and so it should be pretty easy, I'm guessing.
It is, yeah.
Anything else with regard to that hunter survey that we need to share that will be of interest to some of the listeners? I actually would imagine some of the listeners in states other than Minnesota would be interested in seeing the results to some of the questions you're asking there. So who knows, maybe we'll have a chance to share some of that information in the future. But anything else relative to the survey that you want to share with, let's say, your constituents that may be listening to this episode?
I think we've had like 3,500 comments so far on the online survey, and that's a lot. And it's open for 10 more days or something. So we'll get a lot more or more opportunity. And go online. It doesn't take very long to fill it out, and we'll weigh the comments and show them to you at some point. So that's kind of what our goal is just to get input from both waterfowl hunters and perhaps some non-waterfowl hunters on certain waterfowl regs.
Yeah, your voice cannot be heard if you don't speak up, and so this is just one of the many ways that state agencies seek some of that input. So I would certainly encourage the waterfowl constituents in the state of Minnesota to go participate in that survey. Provide your input. Let your voice be heard. So thank you for the details on that, Steve. I want to begin closing up here by talking about breeding habitat conditions. Minnesota provides resources and habitats for waterfowl during both the breeding season and non-breeding season and migration staging area. So you get birds there pretty much year round, except when things freeze up. And so in terms of breeding habitat, we've talked already with Scott Stevens about how things are shaping up in the prairie, some of the early indicators for prairie wetland conditions. Now, as we get into Minnesota, I think there's some part of western Minnesota was historical prairie, but I'm not sure. That's not a big part of the state, and I'm not sure what percentage of the breeding population may occur there. But when you look at sort of breeding habitat conditions in the state of Minnesota, the wetlands in that state, kind of how do you characterize those? They're not as dynamic as what we see in the prairies, are they? And then how do you sort of assess this time of year how those conditions may be unfolding?
Part of Minnesota is very similar to the eastern Dakotas in terms of shallow wetlands that tend to dry and get wet. But I think a lot of our habitat here in most of Minnesota is it's more shallow lakes. So it's a deeper water, less dynamic, I guess is how I would say it. The water level doesn't fluctuate that much. And I guess in terms of like conditions now, it's just hard to say. We have snow statewide, but we're different than Prairie Canada and the Dakotas, but maybe a third of western Minnesota is pretty similar. But with those big shallow lakes, conditions don't change that much from year to year.
Yeah, what are some of the primary breeding species there? I would imagine a fair number of mallards. What are some of the other key species that you find in Minnesota breeding?
Yeah, mallards, number one breeding bird. Teal, blue-winged teal, very close second. Wood ducks, very abundant. Ringneck ducks, we have a decent number of ringneck ducks that nest in northern Minnesota, hooded mergansers, and a lot of the other dabbling duck species and diving duck species nest here, but in lower numbers. We have canvasbacks nest here, redheads, a few pintails, a few green wings, but for the most part, I would say mallards, blue-winged teal, wood ducks, and ringnecks.
Steve, I guess my final question, it relates to some of the breeding waterfowl that we've talked about, and I believe you're going to be the first person that I would have had the opportunity to ask this question. I think we may have referenced it on a previous episode this season, but as we're now in 2021, spring is just kind of around the corner, and we all know that the May breeding population survey occurs in the spring. That's a very key data set for the management of waterfowl populations in North America. And of course, it was not conducted last year, first time in in its 65-year history. And I know we're still in the midst of a pandemic. And I know your state, being important to breeding waterfowl, does participate annually in some part of that survey, or you conduct a breeding survey in your state. I don't think you conducted one last year because of the pandemic. But what can you share with our audience about how things may be shaping up to conduct that survey this year? Do you think we're going to be able to do it, at least in your state, speaking for what you can?
We're under a stay-at-home work order through the end of our fiscal year, which is July 1. So at this point, it seems unlikely that I can fly in May. That could change, but it doesn't look that likely that we'll be able to fly. I've been trying to think about maybe doing some of our ground routes that are part of the aerial survey to come up with like an index. But, it's kind of a like day-to-day thing. It does not seem likely that I'll be able to fly the survey we've flown for 50 years here.
Am I correct that you did not fly it last year?
We did not, no.
Okay. All right. I wanted to make sure that I backed up and corrected myself there if I was wrong. But all right. So I was correct. And well, Steve, I was hoping for some better news. I was hoping that you were telling me that, you've instituted some protocols that are going to help things be safe during the conduct of that survey. But it sounds like as is expected, there are going to be some sort of higher level restrictions that are in place in different states and provinces and countries that are going to make this challenging. And so I guess we can just kind of hope for some rapid change in the way things are in the way things exist with respect to this pandemic right now here over the next few months. And maybe it opens up additional opportunities that we don't see right now. Appreciate all the input that you've provided here on sort of a season recap, your hunter opinion survey, and then some early insights on whether we may be able to conduct a breeding survey, as well as a look at breeding habitats in Minnesota. Well, Steve, thank you so much for taking the time to join us, and look forward to catching up with you again in the future.
Yeah, appreciate the time. Thanks, Mike.
A special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Steve Kortz, waterfowl staff specialist with Minnesota DNR. We appreciate his time and insight on what's happening with waterfowl management in Minnesota. As always, we appreciate and thank our producer, Clay Baird, for the work he does on this podcast. It would not be possible without him. And to you, the listener, we thank you for your time, spending it with us, for supporting the podcast, and for your support, passion, and commitment to wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.